Dexter Evans, a successful FBI agent, boards a flight, eager to focus on a high-profile case. However, what starts as a routine trip quickly takes a shocking turn when a flight attendant, fueled by prejudice, singles him out for humiliation. How will this explosive encounter challenge deeply ingrained biases and change lives forever? Before we dive into this unforgettable story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will leave you inspired. Dexter Evans sat on the edge of his bed, meticulously folding his dark suit into a garment bag. His movements were calm and deliberate, every crease smoothed with care. He wasn't just packing, he was preparing. For Dexter, an FBI agent for over a decade, preparation was second nature. This trip, however, carried an extra weight. The Los Angeles field office had requested his expertise on a case involving a human trafficking ring. It was a critical mission, one that required precision and poise, qualities Dexter had mastered. He glanced at his reflection in the mirror, adjusting his tie before slinging the garment bag over his shoulder. His wife, Camille, leaned against the doorway, her arms crossed, watching him with a mixture of pride and concern. "You're ready for anything, Dex," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of years of partnership. "But don't forget to take care of yourself, too." Dexter offered her a reassuring smile. "Always. Besides, it's just a flight. Nothing I haven't done 100 times. Camille nodded, though her unease lingered. She knew what her husband faced, not just the dangers of his job, but the unspoken challenges that came with his identity. Dexter had always handled himself with dignity, navigating situations that others might crumble under. But the world was often unforgiving. "Call me when you land," she said, stepping forward to straighten his lapel. "First thing," Dexter replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead before heading out the door. The ride to the airport was uneventful, the hum of the car engine a soothing backdrop to Dexter's thoughts. His driver, an older man named Tom, recognized him from previous rides and greeted him warmly. "Morning, Mr. Evans. Heading out for work again, I see." "That's right, Tom." "Early this time," Dexter replied, his tone easy. "Well, safe travels. This city needs more folks like you doing the hard work." Dexter appreciated the sentiment but said nothing further. He wasn't one to dwell on compliments, his focus was always forward. At the airport, Dexter moved through the terminal with practiced efficiency. His tall, athletic frame and confident stride drew occasional glances, though he paid them no mind. He was used to the subtle looks, the flickers of curiosity or judgment. They came with the territory of being a black man in a tailored suit, walking with purpose in spaces where he was often an anomaly. He approached the check-in counter, where a young agent greeted him with a polite smile. "Good morning, sir. May I see your ID and ticket?" Dexter handed over his credentials, watching as the agent's demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly. The smile stiffened and her gaze lingered on his FBI badge longer than necessary. "Thank you, Mr. Evans. You're all set," she said, her voice overly formal. "Appreciate it," Dexter replied, reclaiming his documents and heading toward security. The security line was predictably long, filled with travelers juggling carry-ons and laptops. Dexter joined the queue, his posture relaxed yet alert. He observed his surroundings with the trained eye of someone who had spent years reading people. There were the frazzled parents trying to corral their children, the business travelers glued to their phones, the occasional tourist snapping photos of the terminal. It was the usual airport chaos. When it was his turn, Dexter placed his belongings on the conveyor belt and stepped through the metal detector. The TSA officer, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, waved him through without incident. It was a small relief. Dexter had experienced enough unnecessary scrutiny at checkpoints to know it wasn't guaranteed. He retrieved his items and moved toward the gate, pausing to grab a coffee from a nearby kiosk. As he sipped the steaming cup, his phone buzzed with a text from Camille. "Have a safe flight. Love you." Dexter smiled, typing a quick reply before slipping the phone back into his pocket. He had an hour until boarding, so he found a quiet corner to review his case notes. The files were encrypted on his tablet, a safeguard for the sensitive information they contained. He immersed himself in the details, his mind already piecing together strategies for the task ahead. When the boarding announcement came, Dexter joined the line for first-class passengers. His agency covered the expense for work-related travel, and he was grateful for the extra comfort on long flights. As he approached the gate, the agent scanned his ticket, her expression neutral but polite. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Evans." "Thank you," Dexter replied, stepping into the jet bridge. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin was a sanctuary of plush leather seats and hushed tones. Dexter located his seat near the window and stowed his bag in the overhead compartment. He settled in, adjusting the armrest and glancing briefly at the passengers filtering into the cabin. Most were absorbed in their own routines, adjusting seat belts, checking their phones, or engaging in quiet conversations. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering assistance and ensuring everyone was settled. Dexter noticed one of them, a woman with a crisp uniform and a practiced smile, watching him from the corner of her eye. He didn't think much of it at first. He was used to being observed. But as she lingered near his row, her expression shifted into something less welcoming. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone professional but cool. "Are you in the correct seat?" Dexter met her gaze evenly. "Yes, I believe I am." She frowned, glancing at his ticket, which he handed over without hesitation. She examined it, her lips pressing into a thin line before nodding curtly. "My apologies," she said, though her tone lacked warmth. She handed back the ticket and moved on, leaving Dexter with a faint sense of unease. The boarding process continued without further incident, and soon the plane was taxiing toward the runway. Dexter leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as the engines roared to life. He wasn't nervous about flying, he'd done it countless times. But the brief exchange with the flight attendant lingered in his mind, a subtle reminder of the biases he navigated daily. As the plane ascended, Dexter focused on his breathing, letting the rhythmic hum of the engines soothe him. He had a job to do, and he wouldn't let anything distract him from it. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, a prickling awareness that he couldn't quite shake. He opened his eyes to find the flight attendant from earlier glancing in his direction once again. She quickly averted her gaze, but the moment was enough to confirm Dexter's suspicion this flight might be anything but routine. The sky outside was a brilliant expanse of blue, the plane cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet. Dexter sipped his coffee, now lukewarm, and opened his tablet again. The details of the case demanded his full attention, and he was determined to arrive in LA ready to hit the ground running. Yet, despite his best efforts, his thoughts kept drifting back to the flight attendant's pointed gaze and the subtle tension it carried. He reminded himself to stay composed. Years of experience had taught him the importance of remaining calm under pressure. Whatever the source of her discomfort, it wasn't his responsibility to ease it. His focus was on the mission ahead, and he wouldn't allow himself to be derailed. But as the minutes ticked by and the flight attendant's behavior grew increasingly erratic, Dexter couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. Dexter leaned back in his seat, trying to redirect his focus to the glowing screen of his tablet. The encrypted case files were dense with detailed surveillance photos, suspect profiles, and legal documents outlining the framework of the operation he was heading to Los Angeles to spearhead. Despite his best efforts, he found his concentration waning, distracted by the uneasy energy that seemed to linger in the air around him. The flight attendant, her name tag read Karen Bennett, was making her way through the aisle, her demeanor efficient yet lacking the warmth usually associated with customer service. Dexter noticed that she offered polite smiles to the other passengers as she asked about their needs, but her interactions with him carried a noticeable edge. It wasn't overt enough to be called out, but it was there, a subtle undercurrent that Dexter couldn't ignore. When she reached his row, Karen paused, her hands gripping the serving cart tightly. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Just water, thank you," Dexter replied, keeping his voice neutral. Karen nodded and poured the water into a clear plastic cup. As she handed it to him, her gaze lingered on him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she were trying to piece something together. Dexter sipped his water and offered a polite thank you, but Karen didn't move on right away. Instead, she hesitated, glancing at the seat number above him, then back at the passenger manifest in her hand. She furrowed her brow, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Is there a problem?" Dexter finally asked, his tone calm but direct. Karen snapped her head up, as though startled. "No, not at all," she said quickly. "Just making sure everything is in order with that." She pushed the cart forward, her movements brisk and almost hurried. Dexter exhaled quietly, his grip tightening on the armrest. He had seen this type of behavior before, a series of small, almost imperceptible actions that, taken together, revealed a deep-seated bias. He told himself to let it go, to focus on his work, and not let someone else's discomfort dictate his own. But the feeling of being scrutinized didn't go away. About 30 minutes into the flight, Dexter closed his tablet and leaned back, gazing out the window. The sky was a brilliant expanse of blue, punctuated by wisps of white clouds. It was a tranquil view, a stark contrast to the tension simmering inside the cabin. Karen walked by again, this time without the serving cart. She slowed as she passed Dexter's row, her gaze darting toward him once more. This time she didn't even try to mask her suspicion. Her steps faltered, and she turned toward him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone formal but strained. "Can I see your ticket again?" Dexter raised an eyebrow but complied, pulling the boarding pass from the front pocket of his suit jacket. He handed it to her, watching as she scrutinized it, her lips moving slightly as she read the seat assignment. "This is your seat," she confirmed after a moment, her voice tinged with surprise. "I just wanted to double-check." "I appreciate your diligence," Dexter replied, his tone measured. "But as you can see, everything is in order." Karen flushed slightly, muttering a curt thank you before handing back the ticket. She walked away quickly, her shoulders stiff, leaving Dexter with a sense of rising frustration. Across the aisle, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes leaned toward Dexter. She had been watching the exchange, her brow furrowed in concern. "Is everything all right, young man?" she asked, her voice gentle. Dexter turned toward her, offering a small smile. "Everything's fine, ma'am. Just a little misunderstanding." The woman nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "Well, I hope they sort it out. People ought to leave you be." "Thank you," Dexter said, appreciating the sentiment even as the unease in his chest grew. An hour into the flight, the tension reached a tipping point. Karen returned to Dexter's row, this time accompanied by another flight attendant, a younger man with a nervous demeanor. The two of them stood in the aisle, their postures stiff, and Dexter immediately sensed that something was about to happen. "Sir," Karen began, her voice firm, "I need to ask you to step into the galley with us for a moment." Dexter's brow furrowed. "Is there a problem?" Karen's lips tightened. "We just need to verify some details about your seat assignment." Dexter glanced around the cabin. Passengers were beginning to take notice, their curious gazes flicking toward him. He felt the weight of their stares, the subtle shift in the atmosphere as murmurs began to spread. "I'm comfortable right here," Dexter said, his tone even. "If there's an issue, you're welcome to address it here." Karen's jaw clenched, but the younger attendant stepped in, his voice softer. "It's just a quick clarification, sir. It won't take long." Dexter exhaled slowly, weighing his options. He didn't want to cause a scene, but he also didn't want to be singled out without reason. Finally, he nodded and stood, following the attendants to the galley. In the cramped space of the galley, Karen crossed her arms, her expression sharp. The younger attendant shifted uncomfortably beside her, avoiding Dexter's gaze. "Sir, I need to see your identification," Karen said, her voice steely. Dexter frowned. "Why would you need that?" Karen hesitated, her eyes darting to the younger attendant for support, but he remained silent. Finally, she said, "We've had reports of passengers using false credentials to access first class. It's just a precaution." Dexter stared at her, incredulous. "Is that so? And have you asked anyone else for identification?" Karen didn't answer, but the flush creeping up her neck spoke volumes. "I see," Dexter said, his voice growing colder. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He handed her his ID, watching as she examined it. Her eyes widened slightly as she read the bold letters Federal Bureau of Investigation. Karen's grip on the ID faltered, and she quickly handed it back. Thank you, sir. That will be all." Dexter slid the ID back into his wallet, his movements deliberate. "Is there anything else you need to verify?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with quiet intensity. Karen shook her head, her expression flustered. "No, that's all. Thank you for your cooperation." Dexter nodded and stepped past her, returning to his seat without another word. As he settled back into his spot, he noticed the older woman across the aisle watching him again, her expression a mix of sympathy and indignation. "What was that all about?" she asked softly. "Just a misunderstanding," Dexter replied, though his jaw tightened as he spoke. For the remainder of the flight, Dexter kept to himself, his focus on the case files once again. But the tension in the cabin lingered, a silent testament to the encounter in the galley. Karen avoided his row entirely, her movements around the cabin more hurried and flustered. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Dexter felt a sense of relief. The ordeal was almost over, and he could shift his focus to the work that awaited him. But the sting of the experience remained, a reminder of the biases he faced even in the most mundane settings. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as the plane touched down. Whatever awaited him in Los Angeles, he would handle it with the same resolve he had shown today. Because for Dexter Evans, there was no room for hesitation, only forward momentum. As the plane taxied to its gate at Los Angeles International Airport, Dexter gathered his belongings with methodical precision. His garment bag, briefcase, and tablet were all accounted for, but the subtle weight of the earlier confrontation lingered. He adjusted his tie and took a steadying breath. He had no intention of dwelling on Karen Bennett's behavior, but the undercurrent of injustice left a bitter taste in his mouth. The first-class cabin was eerily quiet as passengers stood to retrieve their bags. Dexter could feel the stares of some who had witnessed the exchange in the galley, their curiosity and unspoken questions hanging in the air. He nodded politely to the older woman across the aisle as she gave him a small, reassuring smile. "Take care, young man," she said softly. "You too, Mom," Dexter replied, his tone warm despite his tension. As he stepped into the aisle, Karen was standing near the galley, her back stiff and her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She avoided his gaze as he passed, her usual air of professionalism now tinged with discomfort. Dexter resisted the urge to glance back, focusing instead on reaching the jet bridge. The terminal was bustling with activity, a sea of travelers navigating their way toward baggage claim and connecting flights. Dexter moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his sharp suit and purposeful stride marking him as someone not to be trifled with. Yet even here he could feel the occasional lingering glance, a silent echo of the scrutiny he had endured on the plane. As he approached the baggage carousel, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw Camille's name on the screen. "Hey," he said, his voice softening. "You landed safely?" Camille asked, her tone a mixture of relief and concern. "Yeah, just grabbing my bag now." There was a pause on the line, and then Camille added, "You sound tense. Everything okay?" Dexter hesitated, debating whether to tell her about the incident. He didn't want to worry her, but he also knew she could sense when something was off. "Just a little airport drama," he said finally. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Camille sighed. "I hate that you have to deal with stuff like that, but I know you'll rise above it like you always do." Her words brought a small smile to Dexter's face. "Thanks, babe. I'll call you tonight after the briefing." "I'll hold you to it," she replied. "Be safe." "You too," Dexter said before ending the call. By the time Dexter reached the curb outside the terminal, a sleek black SUV was waiting for him. The driver, a stocky man in a dark suit and sunglasses, stepped out and opened the rear door. "Agent Evans," the man said with a nod. "Welcome to Los Angeles." "Thanks," Dexter replied, climbing into the back seat. The driver closed the door and returned to the front, maneuvering the vehicle smoothly into traffic. The drive to the field office was uneventful, the city's sprawling landscape unfurling before them. Dexter stared out the window, his mind shifting gears to focus on the case. Yet, as much as he tried to compartmentalize, his thoughts kept drifting back to the flight. He replayed Karen's pointed glances, the unnecessary ticket check, the demand for ID. It wasn't the first time he'd faced such treatment, but it never failed to sting. The memory of her reaction when she saw his FBI badge was particularly telling. The swift shift from suspicion to embarrassment, the hurried retreat, it was a pattern he had encountered many times before. The FBI field office was a fortress of glass and steel, a testament to the agency's presence in the city. Dexter stepped out of the SUV and adjusted his tie before striding through the main entrance. Inside, the air buzzed with activity as agents moved between desks, phones rang, and monitors displayed live feeds from various operations. Agent Evans, a voice called out. Dexter turned to see Agent Maria Sandoval approaching, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. She was one of the lead investigators on the trafficking case and had been the one to request his involvement. Maria Dexter greeted her with a firm handshake. "Good to see you." Likewise, she said, a genuine smile on her face. "I hope your flight wasn't too eventful." Dexter's expression tightened briefly before he forced a smile. "Let's just say I'm glad to be on solid ground." Maria raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "We've got the team assembled in the conference room. You ready to dive in?" "Always," Dexter replied. The briefing was intense, a whirlwind of data, maps, and strategic discussions. The trafficking ring they were targeting was highly organized, with connections spanning multiple states and even international borders. Dexter listened intently, his mind working to synthesize the information into actionable steps. As the meeting concluded, Maria pulled him aside. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low. Dexter hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just shaking off the flight." Maria studied him for a moment before nodding. "Well, if you need anything, let me know. We've got a lot riding on this." "I know," Dexter said, his tone firm. "We'll get it done." Later that evening, Dexter sat in his hotel room, the city lights twinkling outside the window. He had spent the last hour reviewing the case files again, but his mind kept drifting back to the flight. Something about the interaction with Karen nagged at him, a sense that the incident wasn't over. Reaching for his phone, he scrolled through his notifications and froze. A message from a colleague back in D.C. caught his attention. The subject line read "Incident on Flight 207. Dexter opened the message and found a link to a video. His stomach tightened as he clicked on it, the screen filling with shaky footage of Karen confronting him in the galley. The video was captioned "Racial Profiling at 35,000 feet, FBI Agent Targeted by Flight Attendant." Dexter watched in silence as the events replayed before him, the tension in the galley now amplified by the perspective of an outsider. The video had already garnered thousands of views, and the comments section was a battleground of opinions. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Maria. "I assume you've seen the video," she said without preamble. "Just now," Dexter replied, his tone carefully controlled. "It's going viral," Maria said. "The Bureau's media team is already fielding calls. This could get messy." Dexter exhaled slowly. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," Maria said. "But it's out there now. You should be prepared." As the call ended, Dexter leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The flight had been a minor annoyance, something he had intended to forget. But now, it was a public spectacle, a flashpoint in the ongoing conversation about racial bias. He stared out at the city lights, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same resolve he brought to his work. But he couldn't help but wonder how far would this spark spread. The next morning, Dexter's phone buzzed relentlessly, each notification a reminder that the video from the flight had taken on a life of its own. He groaned, rubbing his temples as he scrolled through his inbox. Messages ranged from texts of support from colleagues and friends to requests from journalists looking for a statement. Sitting at the small desk in his hotel room, Dexter opened his laptop. A quick search of his name brought up dozens of articles, each one dissecting the now viral incident. Headlines screamed variations of the same theme. Racial profiling in the sky, FBI agent targeted by flight attendant. Unjust treatment at 35,000 feet, how one man's story is exposing airline bias. FBI agent speaks out after humiliating flight incident, though Dexter hadn't spoken publicly yet. The sheer volume of coverage was overwhelming. The video had struck a nerve, sparking debates about systemic racism, unconscious bias, and the treatment of black passengers in traditionally elite spaces like first class. Dexter leaned back in his chair, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating his tense expression. He hadn't asked for this spotlight, and he certainly hadn't intended for the confrontation with Karen Bennett to become a public spectacle. But now, it was bigger than him. At the FBI field office later that morning, the atmosphere was charged. Agents huddled around monitors, watching news clips of the incident. The team's focus on the trafficking case had taken a back seat as the media frenzy surrounding Dexter's experience dominated the office chatter. Maria Sandoval intercepted him as he entered the building, her face etched with concern. "We need to talk," she said, motioning for him to follow her to a private conference room. Once inside, Maria shut the door and gestured for Dexter to sit. She remained standing, arms crossed, her expression serious. "The higher-ups are aware of the situation," she began. "They're monitoring it closely, and they've instructed me to remind you to be careful about how you engage with the media." "I haven't said a word to anyone," Dexter replied, his tone calm but firm. Maria nodded. "I know, but this is escalating quickly, and they're worried about the Bureau's image." Dexter frowned. "This isn't about the Bureau's image. This is about what actually happened." "I understand that," Maria said, her voice softening. "But you know how these things go. Public perception matters, and right now this story is being spun in all directions." Dexter exhaled sharply, leaning forward in his chair. "I didn't want this, Maria. All I wanted was to get to LA and do my job. Now I'm the face of a controversy I didn't ask for." "I get it," Maria said, sitting across from him. "But you're in it now, whether you like it or not. The best thing you can do is stay focused on the case. Let the Bureau's media team handle the rest." Dexter nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But I'm not going to stay silent if someone asks me directly about it. People deserve to know the truth." Maria hesitated before nodding. "Just tread carefully, okay? The last thing we need is for this to distract from the operation." As the day unfolded, the ripple effects of the incident became increasingly apparent. Social media platforms were flooded with commentary, with hashtags like Flying While Black and Biasyntheskis trending worldwide. Public figures weighed in, some expressing outrage at the treatment Dexter had endured, while others defended the flight attendant, claiming her actions were justified by security concerns. Karen Bennett's name was eventually revealed, sparking a separate wave of controversy. Journalists dug into her past, uncovering previous complaints from passengers who accused her of discriminatory behavior. The airline, meanwhile, issued a carefully worded statement. "We are aware of the incident involving one of our employees and a passenger on Flight 207. We take these matters seriously and are conducting a thorough internal investigation. We are committed to fostering an inclusive and respectful environment for all of our customers." The statement did little to quell the uproar. Activists demanded that the airline take immediate action, while others accused the company of throwing Karen under the bus. It was clear that the incident had become a flashpoint in a much larger conversation about race and privilege. That evening, Dexter sat in the FBI's secure conference room, staring at the whiteboard filled with notes about the trafficking case. He had tried to bury himself in the work, but the steady stream of notifications on his phone made it impossible to concentrate. Finally, he silenced the device and leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. Maria entered the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one down in front of Dexter and took a seat beside him. "Long day?" she asked. Dexter chuckled humorlessly. "That's an understatement." Maria took a sip of her coffee, her gaze thoughtful. "You know, when I first heard about what happened on your flight, I was angry. Not just because of what you went through, but because it's so damn familiar." Dexter looked at her, surprised, familiar. Maria nodded. "My dad was a farm worker. He spent his whole life being looked down on because of his accent, his clothes, his skin. I saw it happen to him more times than I can count. And now, even as an agent, I still get the occasional side eye when I walk into certain rooms." Dexter nodded slowly, appreciating her candor. "It's exhausting, isn't it? Having to prove yourself over and over again, just because people can't see past their biases." Maria smiled faintly. "It is. But the way I see it, every time we push back, we make it a little harder for them to keep those blinders on." Dexter sipped his coffee, mulling over her words. "Maybe you're right. I just wish it didn't always feel like an uphill battle." "It is an uphill battle," Maria said, her tone firm. but you're not fighting it alone. By the next morning, the story had reached a boiling point. News crews gathered outside the FBI field office, hoping to catch a glimpse of Dexter as he arrived for work. He avoided the main entrance, slipping in through a side door to avoid the cameras. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Agents whispered among themselves, their conversations halting as Dexter walked past. He knew the situation had put everyone on edge, but he refused to let it derail him. Maria met him in the hallway, her expression grim. "We've got a problem." "What now?" Dexter asked. Maria handed him a tablet. On the screen was a new video, this one showing Karen Bennett giving an emotional interview to a local news station. In the footage, she defended her actions, claiming she had been following protocol and had no idea Dexter was an FBI agent. "She's doubling down," Maria said. "And some people are buying it." Dexter watched the video in silence, his jaw tightening. Karen's words were carefully chosen, designed to paint herself as the victim of a misunderstanding. But to Dexter, it was clear that she was trying to deflect blame rather than take responsibility. "She's not going to admit she was wrong," Dexter said finally. "That much is obvious." Maria nodded. "But her statement is raising more questions than answers. The airline's investigation is still ongoing, and the pressure is mounting." Dexter set the tablet down, his resolve hardening. "Good, maybe this time they'll actually hold someone accountable." Maria studied him for a moment before placing a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever happens, just remember you're doing the right thing. Whether you wanted this spotlight or not, your story is making a difference." Dexter nodded, her words sinking in. He didn't ask for this fight, but now that he was in it, he was determined to see it through. Dexter sat in the back of the unmarked black SUV, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the leather seat. The driver navigated the dense Los Angeles traffic with practiced ease, the hum of the city's chaos providing a low soundtrack to Dexter's racing thoughts. The past 48 hours had been a whirlwind. The viral video, Karen Bennett's interview, and the relentless news cycle had turned him into an unwitting symbol of systemic injustice. Yet here he was, trying to focus on his actual job, breaking apart a sprawling human trafficking ring. The meeting at the courthouse was critical. Dexter would be presenting the Bureau's findings to the assistant U.S. attorney, ensuring the case moved toward prosecution. It was the culmination of months of work, and Dexter had no intention of letting personal distractions derail the operation. As the SUV came to a halt outside the courthouse, Maria Sandoval appeared on the sidewalk, her tablet clutched under one arm. She wore her usual confident expression, though her eyes betrayed the same exhaustion Dexter felt. "Ready for this?" she asked as he stepped out of the vehicle. "Always," Dexter replied, forcing a small smile. Maria nodded and led him into the courthouse. The fluorescent lights of the hallway were stark, casting harsh shadows as they walked. Dexter adjusted his tie, the motion as much a ritual of grounding as it was preparation. He couldn't afford to falter now. The conference room was filled with tension. The assistant U.S. attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Jillian Bryce, sat at the head of the table, flanked by her legal team. The Bureau's team, including Dexter and Maria, filled the other seats. Case files were spread across the table, the weight of their contents palpable. Jillian leaned forward, her piercing gaze locking onto Dexter. "Agent Evans, you've been central to this operation. I want to hear it from you. Do we have enough to take these guys down?" Dexter straightened in his seat, his voice steady as he began to outline the evidence. He spoke with precision, detailing the trafficking ring's operations, the key players, and the victims they had identified. As he spoke, the room fell silent, the gravity of the situation sinking in. When he finished, Jillian nodded, her expression hard. "This is solid work. We'll move forward with the indictments. But I need you to be prepared, Agent Evans. If this goes to trial, you're going to be the face of this case. Are you ready for that?" Dexter hesitated for the briefest moment before responding. "I'm ready." Jillian studied him for a moment before standing. "Good. Let's make sure these people never hurt anyone again." The sense of accomplishment from the meeting was short-lived. As Dexter and Maria left the courthouse, they were met by a swarm of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and questions flew from every direction. Agent Evans, do you have a statement about the flight incident? Do you believe racial bias played a role in what happened? Have you seen Karen Bennett's latest interview? Maria moved to shield him from the chaos, her voice sharp as she addressed the crowd. No comment. Agent Evans is focused on his work. But the reporters weren't deterred, their shouts growing louder as Dexter pushed through the throng. Once safely inside the SUV, he let out a long breath, the tension in his chest easing only slightly. Maria glanced at him, her expression a mix of sympathy and frustration. This isn't going away anytime soon. I know, Dexter said, his tone weary. But I can't let it distract me. We've got bigger things to deal with. Back at the field office, Dexter tried to refocus on the case, but the noise from the outside world continued to seep in. News clips played on the break room TV, headlines flashing across the screen. Flight attendant claims FBI agent intimidated her. Airline faces backlash over viral video. Dexter clenched his jaw as he watched Karen Bennett's face appear on the screen. Her tone was contrite, but her words were carefully crafted to shift blame. I was just doing my job, she said, her voice wavering slightly. I never intended to offend anyone, but I had to follow protocol. When I realized he was an FBI agent, I felt awful. It was all a misunderstanding. The clip ended, and the anchors launched into a discussion about the broader implications of the incident. Dexter turned away, his frustration mounting. It wasn't just about Karen's actions, it was about the way her narrative was being framed, as though her discomfort justified her behavior. Maria entered the room, her expression grim. You need to see this, she said, handing him a tablet. Dexter took the device, his eyes scanning the screen. It was a new video, this one recorded by a fellow passenger on the flight. It showed Karen confronting him in the galley, her voice sharp and accusatory. The passenger had also recorded the aftermath, capturing the quiet humiliation on Dexter's face as he returned to his seat. The video was unedited, raw, and damning. This just hit the internet, Maria said. It's already blowing up. Dexter set the tablet down, his hands tightening into fists. He had tried to maintain his composure, to handle the situation with dignity. But now the entire world was seeing what he had endured, and there was no escaping the scrutiny. That evening, Dexter sat alone in his hotel room, the weight of the day pressing down on him. His phone buzzed with messages of support from friends, family, and colleagues, but they did little to ease the storm inside him. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, Maria stood there, holding 2 takeout bags. I figured you could use some company, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Dexter managed a small smile. Thanks. The two of them sat at the small table by the window, the city lights twinkling outside. They ate in silence for a while before Maria spoke. You know, this whole thing, it's bigger than you, she said. People are seeing what you went through, and it's forcing them to confront some uncomfortable truths. Dexter sighed, setting his fork down. I know, but it doesn't make it any easier. Maria nodded. No, it doesn't. But maybe it'll lead to something better. Change doesn't happen without a fight. Dexter leaned back in his chair, her words settling over him. He didn't ask for this fight, but now that he was in it, he couldn't back down. Whether he liked it or not, he had become a symbol of resilience in the face of bias, and he wasn't going to let that go to waste. Tomorrow, the battle would continue. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The hum of the FBI field office was a stark contrast to the storm brewing outside its walls. Dexter sat at his desk, scrolling through emails and case updates, but his focus was fractured. The incident on the flight was no longer just a headline, it had become a national conversation. The FBI's media team had reached out earlier, urging him to let the Bureau handle public relations, but he knew the issue had outgrown any scripted responses they could offer. As if on cue, Maria appeared in the doorway, her expression grim. They're here, she said. Dexter frowned. Who? The airline's legal team. They've requested a meeting. Dexter leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. He had expected some kind of response from the airline, but not this soon. He stood, straightening his tie, and followed Maria down the hallway to the conference room. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. 3 representatives from the airline, 2 attorneys, and a senior PR executive sat on one side of the table. Dexter and Maria took seats across from them. The lead attorney, a polished man with silver hair and a practiced smile, extended a hand. "Agent Evans, thank you for meeting with us. I'm Thomas Reed, General Counsel for the airline." Dexter shook his hand, his expression neutral. "Mr. Reed, we want to start by expressing our deepest apologies for what you experienced on Flight 207. Reed began. "It's clear that mistakes were made, and we're committed to addressing them." Dexter nodded but remained silent, waiting for Reed to continue. Reed shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable under Dexter's unwavering gaze. "The airline is conducting a full investigation into the incident. In the meantime, we'd like to offer a formal apology, as well as a gesture of goodwill." He slid an envelope across the table. Dexter didn't reach for it. "What kind of gesture?" Dexter asked, his tone measured. "A monetary settlement," Reed replied. "And of course, we'd like to work with you to ensure incidents like this don't happen again. Perhaps we could collaborate on bias training for our staff." Dexter stared at the envelope, his jaw tightening. "You think this is about money?" "No, of course not," Reed said quickly. "But we want to make amends." Dexter leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "What happened on that flight wasn't just a mistake, it was the result of systemic bias, something that won't be fixed with a check or a training seminar." The Puerto Rico executive, a young woman with sharp features, interjected. "We're aware of the larger implications, Agent Evans. That's why we're taking this so seriously. We believe this can be a moment of growth for the airline and a chance to lead by example." Dexter glanced at Maria, who gave him a subtle nod. He turned back to the airline representatives. "If you're serious about making a change, it starts with accountability. That flight attendant didn't act in a vacuum. Your policies, your culture, they allowed her behavior to go unchecked." Reed looked uncomfortable but nodded. "We understand. We're prepared to make significant changes." Dexter leaned back, his expression skeptical. "We'll see." By the time the meeting ended, Dexter felt both vindicated and exhausted. The airline representatives had promised a thorough review of their practices, but he knew promises were easy to make and harder to keep. Back at his desk, his phone buzzed with a new notification. It was a news alert. "Karen Bennett speaks out again. I was misunderstood." Dexter clicked the link, his stomach tightening as he read the article. Karen had doubled down on her narrative, claiming she had been unfairly vilified. Her words painted herself as the true victim, someone overwhelmed by the pressures of her job. "She's playing the sympathy card," Maria said, leaning over his shoulder to read the article. "She's trying to shift the narrative," Dexter muttered. "And some people are buying it." Maria frowned. "What are you going to do?" Dexter hesitated. He had avoided speaking out publicly, wanting to focus on his work and avoid further inflaming the situation. But Karen's comments were spreading, muddying the waters of what had really happened. Staying silent no longer felt like an option. Later that evening, Dexter sat in his hotel room, the city lights casting long shadows across the walls. His laptop was open in front of him, a blank document waiting for his words. After a moment of hesitation, he began to type. "My name is Dexter Evans, and I'm an FBI agent. I don't usually share personal experiences, but after recent events, I feel compelled to speak up." He wrote with care, recounting the events of the flight without embellishment. He focused on the broader issues of bias and systemic inequality, framing his story as part of a larger struggle rather than a personal grievance. When he finished, he read over the statement twice before posting it to his social media accounts. Within minutes, the response was overwhelming. Comments poured in, many expressing outrage and support, while others were predictably defensive or dismissive. Dexter ignored the negativity, focusing instead on the messages of solidarity. People from all walks of life shared their own stories of discrimination, creating a tapestry of shared experiences that spoke to the depth of the problem. The next morning, Dexter's statement was making headlines. News outlets dissected his words, and social media lit up with discussions about his post. Karen's narrative, which had dominated the conversation just a day earlier, was quickly overshadowed by the raw power of Dexter's account. At the field office, Maria greeted him with a rare grin. Looks like you're winning the public over. Dexter shook his head. This isn't about winning. It's about making people see the truth. Maria nodded, her expression turning serious. Well, they're seeing it now, and it's making a difference. Meanwhile, Karen Bennett's world was unraveling. The airline had placed her on administrative leave pending the results of their investigation. Her attempts to defend herself only seemed to backfire, with public opinion turning sharply against her. Karen sat in her modest apartment, scrolling through the news coverage on her tablet. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she read the latest headlines. Flight attendants' actions spark national debate on racial bias. Karen Bennett's missteps highlight larger issues in airline industry. She set the tablet down, her mind racing. She hadn't intended for things to spiral this far out of control. In her heart, she believed she had been following protocol, but the mounting evidence and the public's reaction forced her to confront the possibility that she had been wrong. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. Karen thought back to her training, the biases she had internalized over the years without even realizing it. For the first time, she saw herself through a different lens, not as a victim, but as someone who had caused harm. As the week progressed, the airline announced a series of sweeping changes. They committed to mandatory bias training for all employees, revised their protocols for handling in-flight incidents, and issued a public apology to Dexter. While some viewed these steps as performative, others saw them as a sign of progress. For Dexter, the changes were a step in the right direction, but he knew the fight was far from over. The incident on the flight was just one example of a much larger problem, one that would require sustained effort and vigilance to address. As he sat in his hotel room that night, reflecting on the whirlwind of events, his phone buzzed with a text from Camille. "Proud of you, Dex. You're making a difference." Dexter smiled, her words a balm to his weary spirit. He hadn't sought the spotlight, but now that he was in it, he was determined to use it for good. The fire that had been ignited on Flight 207 was still burning, but for the first time, Dexter felt a glimmer of hope. Change was possible, slow, messy, and imperfect, but possible, and he would do everything in his power to keep pushing forward. The Los Angeles sunlight filtered through the glass windows of the FBI field office, casting long shadows on Dexter's desk. The past week had been a whirlwind, but there was a sense of calm creeping back into his routine. The trafficking case he'd been brought to LA to oversee was progressing well. The suspects were in custody, the victims were receiving the help they needed, and Dexter's role in the investigation had been solidified as a key component of its success. Still, the events from Flight 207 loomed large in his mind, even as the world began to settle into its next media cycle. Karen Bennett's name had faded from headlines, but the changes spurred by the incident continued to ripple outward. For Dexter, the fallout wasn't just about the airline or Karen, it was about what came next for him and the broader fight for equity. Agent Evans, Maria's voice broke his thoughts. She stood in the doorway with a file in hand, her expression neutral but expectant. "Yeah," Dexter said, sitting up straighter. "They're ready for us in the conference room, debriefing on the case." "Be right there," Dexter replied, grabbing his notes and following her down the hallway. The conference room buzzed with activity as agents shuffled through files and prepared their summaries. Jillian Bryce, the assistant U.S. attorney, was at the head of the table, her sharp gaze scanning the room as Dexter and Maria took their seats. "Let's get started," Jillian said, her tone brisk. "Agent Evans, excellent work on this case. Your coordination with local law enforcement was crucial in dismantling this ring." "Thank you," Dexter replied, his voice steady. "The credit goes to the team." Jillian nodded but continued to focus on Dexter. "I understand you've had additional distractions this past week. I want to commend you for handling everything with professionalism." Dexter inclined his head. He appreciated the acknowledgement, but he knew this was more than a compliment. It was a veiled inquiry about whether he could remain focused on his work amidst the media frenzy. "The case has always been my priority," Dexter said firmly. "That hasn't changed." Jillian seemed satisfied with his response. "Good. Let's move on to the next steps." As the meeting progressed, Dexter felt a renewed sense of purpose. The case was a reminder of why he'd joined the Bureau in the first place: to make a difference, to fight for justice in all its forms. And while the incident on the plane had been deeply personal, It had only reinforced his commitment to those ideals. After the meeting, Dexter found himself in the break room, pouring a cup of coffee when Maria walked in. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms as she studied him. "You okay?" she asked. Dexter nodded. "Yeah, why?" Maria shrugged. "You've been quieter than usual. Just making sure you're not carrying more than you need to." Dexter offered a faint smile. "Thanks, but I'm good. It's been a lot, but I can handle it." Maria seemed to accept his answer, though she didn't look entirely convinced. "For what it's worth, you've handled this whole thing better than most people would." Dexter sipped his coffee, letting her words sink in. "Thanks," he said. "I just hope it's made a difference." That evening, Dexter returned to his hotel room, exhausted but satisfied with the day's work. He had just kicked off his shoes and loosened his tie when his phone buzzed with a video call from Camille. He answered, and her face filled the screen, her warm smile immediately lifting his spirits. "Hey you," she said, her tone soft but cheerful. "How's my favorite FBI agent?" Exhausted Dexter replied with a chuckle. "But I'm good. How about you?" Same old," Camille said. "But I've been keeping up with everything online. You've really started something, Dex." Dexter sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean to start anything. I just told the truth." "And sometimes that's all it takes," Camille said. "People needed to hear your story. And now look, policies are changing, people are talking. That's because of you." Dexter smiled faintly, her words a balm to his weariness. "It's not just me, it's everyone who's spoken out, everyone who's shared their experiences." Camille nodded. "Still, you've done something important, and I'm proud of you." "Thanks, babe," Dexter said, his voice softening. "I just hope it lasts." The next day, Dexter received an unexpected call from the airline's CEO, a woman named Olivia Hart. She requested a meeting, and though Dexter was initially hesitant, he agreed. They arranged to meet at a neutral location, a private conference room in a downtown hotel. When Dexter arrived, Olivia was already there, waiting with an assistant and a stack of documents. She stood as he entered, extending a hand. "Agent Evans, thank you for agreeing to meet with me," she said. "I'm Olivia Hart." Dexter shook her hand, his expression neutral. "MS Hart." "Please call me Olivia," she said, gesturing for him to sit. Once they were seated, Olivia began. "I want to start by apologizing personally for what you experienced. It was unacceptable, and we failed you as a company." Dexter listened silently, his posture calm but alert. Olivia continued, "The incident has been a wake-up call for us. We've already implemented mandatory bias training for all employees, and we're reviewing our policies to ensure nothing like this happens again. But I wanted to hear from you directly. What more can we do?" Dexter appreciated her directness, but he didn't let his guard down. "It's a start," he said. "But it's not just about training. It's about changing the culture, making sure employees understand why this behavior isn't just wrong but harmful, and it needs to come from the top." Olivia nodded, taking notes. "I couldn't agree more. That's why I'm here. I want to do better for you and for every passenger who's ever felt unwelcome on our flights." The sincerity in her voice gave Dexter pause. He had been prepared for more corporate doublespeak, but Olivia seemed genuinely committed to making a change. "I appreciate that," Dexter said. "But words aren't enough. Let's see the action." "You will," Olivia promised. As Dexter left the meeting, he felt a cautious sense of optimism. He didn't fully trust the airline to follow through, but he knew he had planted a seed. Whether it grew into something meaningful remained to be seen. Back at the field office, Dexter shared the details of the meeting with Maria, who nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like they're feeling the pressure," she said. "They should," Dexter replied. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been treated like they didn't belong." Maria smiled. "Well, if anyone can keep them accountable, it's you." Dexter chuckled. "I'll do my best." As the week came to a close, Dexter finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. He stood on the balcony of his hotel room, staring out at the sprawling city below. The light stretched endlessly, a reminder of the countless lives intersecting in this vast metropolis. He thought about the victims he had helped rescue, the colleagues who had supported him, and the people who had shared their own stories in response to his. It wasn't a perfect world, but it was one worth fighting for. Dexter took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in days he felt a sense of peace. He had faced the storm, and though it had left its mark, he had emerged stronger. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But Dexter Evans was ready for whatever came next. Dexter Evans stood in front of a packed auditorium at a local community center in Los Angeles. The room buzzed with anticipation, every seat filled with people eager to hear his story. The past weeks had transformed his life in ways he hadn't anticipated, and this speaking engagement was just one of the many invitations he had received to address audiences across the country. The backdrop displayed the words "Breaking Barriers: Conversations on Equity and Justice." Dexter adjusted the microphone, his sharp suit catching the light as he surveyed the crowd. Faces of all ages and backgrounds looked back at him, united by a desire to understand and perhaps to change. "Good evening," Dexter began, his voice steady but warm. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight. It means a lot, not just to me, but to everyone who has ever been made to feel less than they are." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. "I've spent much of my career in the shadows," Dexter continued. "As an FBI agent, my job has been to solve problems quietly, to let the work speak for itself. But sometimes the silence isn't enough. Sometimes you have to step into the light." The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. After his meeting with Olivia Hart, the airline had followed through on many of its promises. Bias training had been implemented across all levels of the organization, and new protocols were introduced to ensure fair treatment of passengers. Karen Bennett had resigned from her position, though the airline had opted to keep the details of her departure confidential. Dexter hadn't celebrated Karen's resignation. It wasn't about one person, it was about dismantling the system that had enabled her behavior. Still, he couldn't ignore the impact the incident had had on her life. Through a mutual acquaintance, Dexter learned that Karen had started attending workshops on implicit bias. Whether her actions were motivated by genuine remorse or a desire to rehabilitate her image, Dexter didn't know. But he hoped she was learning. For Dexter, the changes within the airline were only part of the story. The video of the incident continued to circulate, drawing attention to similar cases across the country. Activists and community leaders reached out to Dexter, inviting him to collaborate on initiatives aimed at addressing systemic inequality. He found himself stepping into a new role, not just as an FBI agent, but as an advocate. In the auditorium, Dexter paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. "When the video of my experience on Flight 207 went viral, I was flooded with messages," he said. "Some were supportive, others not so much. But what stood out to me were the stories, hundreds, maybe thousands, of people sharing their own encounters with bias and discrimination. It reminded me that this isn't just my story, it's ours." A hand shot up in the front row. Dexter nodded to the young woman, inviting her to speak. "Agent Evans," she began, her voice tinged with emotion, "how do you stay hopeful when the system feels so broken?" Dexter considered her question carefully. "That's a tough one," he admitted. "There are days when it feels overwhelming, when it feels like nothing will ever change. But then I look at the people who are fighting, people like all of you in this room, and I realize that change doesn't happen overnight. It happens one step at a time, one conversation at a time." The woman nodded, her eyes shining with determination. After the event, Dexter lingered in the auditorium, shaking hands and taking photos with attendees. A middle-aged man approached him, his expression hesitant but earnest. "Agent Evans," the man said, extending a hand. "I just wanted to say thank you. My son saw your video, and it sparked a conversation we'd never had before. It opened his eyes and mine." Dexter shook the man's hand firmly. "That means a lot. Thank you for sharing that." The man nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Keep doing what you're doing. The world needs it." That night, Dexter returned to his hotel room, exhausted but fulfilled. He sat by the window, gazing out at the city lights, His phone buzzed with a new text from Camille. Saw the photos from tonight's event. You were amazing. So proud of you. Dexter smiled, his heart warming at her words. He typed a quick reply before setting the phone down. As he leaned back in his chair, he allowed himself a moment to reflect. The past few weeks had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. They had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about the world, but about himself. He had learned to use his voice in a way he never had before, and while the journey was far from over, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The next morning, Dexter received a call from Olivia Hart. The airline had finalized a partnership with a national advocacy organization to expand its efforts on equity and inclusion. Olivia invited Dexter to participate in the initiative, offering him a platform to continue the conversation. Dexter accepted, knowing that the work ahead would be challenging but necessary. Back in D.C., a week later, Dexter returned to the FBI headquarters. His colleagues greeted him warmly, their respect for him evident in their interactions. Maria stopped by his desk, a rare smile on her face. Back to the grind, huh, she teased. Dexter chuckled. Wouldn't have it any other way. Maria leaned against his desk, her expression turning serious. You've made a real difference, Dex, not just with the case, but with everything else. Don't forget that. Thanks, Maria, Dexter said. But it's not just me. It's everyone who's willing to speak up, everyone who's willing to listen. Maria nodded, her admiration clear. Still, you've done something important, and we're lucky to have you. Dexter smiled, her words a reminder of the support that had carried him through the chaos. That evening, Dexter and Camille sat on their front porch, the sun dipping below the horizon as a soft breeze rustled the trees. Camille rested her head on Dexter's shoulder, her presence grounding him. You've been through a lot, she said, but you've come out stronger. Dexter nodded, his gaze distant but calm. It's been a journey, that's for sure. But I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Camille smiled, her hand finding his. And where's that? Right here, Dexter said, his voice steady. With you, doing the work that matters. As the stars began to emerge, Dexter felt a deep sense of peace. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Because for him, the journey wasn't just about justice, it was about hope, resilience, and the belief that change, no matter how slow, was always worth pursuing.